All right, well, it looks like it's 2 after 7, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Heather Miller, and I'm an adult programming librarian at the La Crosse Public Library. And I'm so glad you could join us tonight for our presentation, Fearless Plant Propagation. We're so glad to be joined by Nika Vaughan she's an owner of Plant Salon, which is a plant boutique in Chicago, Illinois, that specializes in beautifying people and plants. So thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. Hey guys. I'm Nika and I am a lifelong plant collector. My shop, Plant Salon, is relatively new. It's less than 2 years old. It is totally a COVID pivot. I have 20 years experience in the hair and makeup world for weddings, and my studio in downtown Chicago, weddings with COVID did not, everything got shut down, but I happened to keep my personal plant collection at work. So I had about 200 plants that I had to still go downtown and water and take care of. And one day I was like, you know what? I think we should be a plant shop. Everyone always mistook us for a plant shop. And I was like, we're going to do it. And I thought, well, here we were Salon and now we're plants. So let's be Plant Salon. And that's how we got to here today. Right now we are in not the shop, we're in our grow space, our warehouse space in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And this is where we do most of our tinkering, growing, propagating. Everyone who works here, no one's a horticulturist. We're all just like lifelong enthusiasts, diehard plant lovers. So it's a lot of tried and true practices, things that work, things that don't. And we love to experiment. So one of the things we love to do the most is propagate plants. And propagation means to just make a new plant. There's all kinds of ways to do it. Some of the most simplest ways is plant division. If you've got like a really big plant in a pot and you see roots coming out of everywhere and you're like, this plant, I'm gonna repot it, but I have no more place in my house to put this huge plant. You're like, maybe my sister would like a piece of this plant, and you go to repot it and it kind of falls apart easily. Pothos are great plants for that. Trailing philodendrons, this is like a Micans philodendron here. Each stem is its own plant. So when you go to repot it, it's very easy to divide it and separate it. That's probably the simplest. One of the other simplest ways to get into propagation is water propagation. I love it. I think, especially if you're somebody who lives with their plants or styles, you like to kind of have plants everywhere. Water propagation is just having a glass or vessel of water and you stick some cuttings in it. This is very low tech. I tend to, because I love to water propagate, I will collect cuttings. So a cutting is a part of your plant where you cut it where a root is possible to grow from. So different plants have different growth points. This is a snake plant. This is a Yellowstone. Both Yellowstone, yeah, these are both Yellowstone Sansevieria, commonly called snake plants. And their growth points kind of grow in stripes as you go through the leaf. So you can kind of cut the leaf this is one long one. You could cut it in many little chunks. I keep it one long one because I'm going to put this in water after I let the ends callus off a little bit more. And then they will grow roots from the base of the cutting. So the tricky part with water propagation, the only tricky part with water propagation is just being aware of where your growth point is. So I think in here, this is like a salad of water propagations. This is very real. If you have this in your house, we are kindreds. That you're like, I have a little bit of everything sometimes all over my house. So this one, let's see. This is what will happen. Ooh. This is probably, I would say, maybe 2 to 3 months worth of growth here. These roots are totally ready to get potted in soil. What's nice is with having water propagation, it's great for a very laid back, low maintenance home garden or garden. If you're somebody who kind of loves just watching your plants grow slowly, you are not in a rush to keep like touching and fiddling with them and repotting them. This is a great practice because it kind of, you just have to refill the water and watch the different plants grow. The trick with what we specialize here in is tropical houseplants. And the trick with tropical houseplants is, one, you want to know that growth point. On most plants, it's called a node. The node is where the blueprint of the plant is. So on a tropical houseplant, most the nodes are going to be on the main stem, and it is where the leaf petiole, this stem, this was called a petiole, where it meets the main stem and where there are aerial roots coming out. It's almost like a really, like where highways come together and merge and crisscross. It's like there's a lot going on in that little space. That's the blueprint of your plant. That is the part that will help you make a new plant. If you were to cut, and this is the saddest thing to see when you see someone who wants to give you a cutting or they want to trade with you, and if it's something really cool and rare and they give you a cutting and it's like just a leaf with this little stem, there's no information in this petiole. There's no blueprint to grow a new plant. At best, some plants, if you have just a leaf, they will root from just their base of their petiole, but they're basically like a flower arrangement. They're just going to keep that leaf alive. Everyone's favorite example of that, it's buried back here, Hoya Carrie. These are very popular around Valentine's Day. And so they're great because they're such a cute heart. And many times when you buy this, all you are buying is a heart-shaped leaf. So when we get these, we actually try to unpack them right away to see is it growing from a node? Is there like a bit of a stem and a branch at the base of this plant? So if you're going to take a cutting from your own plant, you want to be sure, like, I'm really getting something that has that blueprint of information to grow a new plant with. So you want to look for the aerial roots, the main stem, and I will even call it finding like the Y shape. And a really good example is like on this Philodendron micans. I'm gonna break off a snap and make a new water propagation. So here we have a stem. This is the base, this is the top, and where the Y of the petiole and the main stem, there are little aerial roots. There's even like a little pink sheath from where the new growth came out of. That is what I would want to have submerged in water to get new roots growing. And in order to get a fuller plant of especially like a trailing plant, like a pothos or a trailing philodendron, you're going to need a lot of these. So this is great if you like have a friend who's got a really full, luscious pothos and you're like, are you taking any cuttings anytime soon? Go ahead and get like 3 or 4 and put them in the same glass so they all root out together so that when you pot them, you're already starting off with a fuller pot. Does anyone have any questions about water propagation? Everyone's good, just taking notes. Let's see, I am going to start off with then showing you guys something we do a lot here is when you're at the point where you need to pot your propagation, we do a lot of propagating succulents because one, it's super easy. It's just really easy. Do you use moving? Yes. I do. One sec. I do. You asked a great question. And now here's the deal. And this is the point when I would actually use a product like this. These are just examples of a rooting growth hormone. And it is a powder that has nutrients and a fungicide in it to help promote new root growth for a young, more tender plant. I personally don't do it in, this affects the plant if you listen. Could someone read that one for me? I'm not sure if someone's muted. I went a little fast.
Oh, the initial question was, can you submerge more than one node in water? And then does it affect the plant if you do submerge multiple nodes?
No. So first question was about the root growth hormone. So what I will say about that one is I prefer, it's a dry powder. This is better to dip when we're at this stage, when we're at this stage of having such an established root, I would coat this root in the root growth hormone powder. I use a paintbrush, just a kid's paintbrush, something really basic. It's part of my gardening tool bag, and I leave it in there. I just dust it with powder, and then I pot it in the plant. And that's kind of like giving it a really great, it's not about a vitamin, but it's like giving it a great boost to help support it as this root is growing stronger and branching out more. So that's about root growth hormone. For water, there are people who get into like things like Super Thrive and Newt, and for water propagation, especially if you do Lecka propagation. And I'm super laid back, so I don't go that route. I feel like once I have roots, I'm going to pot it up anyway. For the multiple nodes in a pot, you can absolutely. I have here, this is a gargantuan. This is gonna be my what not to do. I was gonna show you what not to do later, but I'll sneak it in now. So this is a vessel with Lecka that is growing some algae, which is so sad. But all of this section here is actually rooted. And so after time, the plant will keep growing in the water. So even if you start off with just one node in the water, if you keep a plant growing in water for like 6 months, like a really extended amount of time, it is growing. It's a plant growing in water. So it will grow more substantial overall. It will grow more nodes and more things in the water. If you're going to go take that initial cut, what you will find is the part that is making contact that's closest to the water is where those new roots activate. So the parts that are submerged in the water is where the roots will activate, and maybe the node right above it. But if it's like, where did I like my mic and stuff? It's like one of these guys, and I were to stick all of these in water, really only like maybe 1 or 2 nodes is going to activate, and the rest are just going along for the ride. So some people, when they're propagating a trailing plant that has close together nodes like that, they will cut them even tighter. And they might even use like we're gonna talk about like a moss propagating method. So that way they can have 4 separate nodes actively growing roots at once, versus this is more of like an arrangement where it's that lowest node doing all the work of growing roots. So that's that. Of course, no worries. So this thing, I love that you asked about the root growth hormone. And I have to say, when we are really going fast, we probably don't use it as much as I would use it at my house at home. When I'm really like potting a lot of the same thing, we just kind of go really fast. If you have something that you're like, this is my precious, I bought this thing on Etsy, it did not like being in the mail, I have to water propagate it just to get roots back, then when you go to pot it, you might want to do something like babying it with the root growth hormone. What I'm going to show you guys now is when you're ready to pot something, what are the components you use to pot? So here are just some different examples. So this is a potting soil mix. This is not with garden soil from outside. We generally do not use outside, like the same thing you would use in your vegetable garden. We don't use, especially for tropical plants, it tends to be way too dense and wet and heavy. It holds water way too well. It almost has too much clay in it. Think of it that way. We want something that is nice and airy. So to help make our potting mix airy, we add these different components to it. The most basic component is going to be cocoa coir and maybe sphagnum peat moss, which you can use in all kinds of gardening. And then you're going to add perlite to it. So if you buy a pre-made indoor house potting mix that has perlite in it, great. That is meant just for general indoor use. If you're like, I am loving playing with succulents, I love all of the ones in my kitchen are so happy. I feel like sometimes they overwater though. And I feel like maybe that their soil stays wet a little too long. If ever you start to see like a green moss growing on top of your soil, that means your soil is retaining enough moisture that a nice little elf village, a nice little mossy bed is starting to take root, and it can support that. That means it's not drying out between waterings. And you might find that if you bought a plant or you read online that you're like, oh, this plant, my cactus, my succulent really likes to dry out between waterings. what can you do with your store-bought peat moss or potting mix to make it a faster draining mix for your plant? That's when you want to know about these other, just the loose components, because now you can start to add them. It's almost like when you're making bread and it's too doughy, it's too stretchy and wet still, and you add more flour to it. The same idea is going to apply to your potting soil. If you're like, this works fine when I'm potting my prayer plants, but I feel like it stays wet a little too long for my jade plants, I would then make a separate batch of this, a container off the side, and add extra perlite. And so if you go online, what you might notice is that some places will talk about the percentages. And what they mean is they put like, 10% more perlite in. If you are mathematically inclined, that is a wonderful way to work. If you're the kind of cook who uses pinches of things, this is a safe place. It totally is fine. It will totally most likely survive. So all you're doing is making this a faster draining soil mixture than the original. And so I want to use this fastest draining soil potting mix with my succulent that likes to dry out a lot. So I'm going to go ahead, pinch my little nursery pot. With succulents, if you're going to repot, this was a cutting that rooted out. So now it has a nice tiny little root ball, right? It was just a top cutting of another plant. And in fact, I can probably show you. I don't think it came from this exact one, but this one was from my mother-in-law. She sent me this scary, scary tree. I hope she's not watching. It was lovely. It's lovely. It needed some work though. And that's what she said. It was like being supported by rocks. It was like growing at this crazy angle, and it had like octopus tendrils. So I cut back all of the tendril branches and I propagated them into new cuttings. And that's what that is. And that's what's so nice about plants is you can kind of make more plants from the plants you have, right? So there's that guy. So we're taking this top cutting. We have our root ball. I have, and I want to show you, I know some people are going to gasp because they're like, no, there's no drainage in this pot. And some people have very hard and fast rules about drainage. And I think it's kind of like there are rules you can bend and rules you can break. And I feel like drainage is a rule we can bend, especially if you are someone who styles around your home with your water propagations, or you like to use old vintage pottery or, ceramic ware, and you're trying to repurpose something. You can absolutely get drill bits that will drill hollow, like just a hole in the bottom of the piece. But if you're kind of like, I don't want water on that shelf, I really want it to be self-contained. What you want to do then is make sure that what you are potting in your no drainage vessel is going to want to drain the water to the lowest point as quickly as possible. Does that make sense? So I want to make sure it's not such a spongy, dense potting mix that it wants to keep all that water dispersed throughout the whole vessel. I want to give a little sip to this plant because it's a small vessel. It's not going to need a big drink of water. I'm going to give a sip to this plant in here, and I want that water to quickly drain to the lowest point. And then as the top dries out, it will pull the water from the base upwards. So I'm going to take my very perlite heavy mix. Oh, actually, I want to show you guys first. In drainage layer, this is again a rule you can bend or a rule you can break. Previous generations of gardeners swore by putting broken pieces of crockery, rocks, something to help your potted plant drain through the base. So what you will find now is there's been a lot of studies that you don't need to do that. You can literally just, if you're having, especially like a pot, like, it's a nursery pot, it's a terracotta pot, you can just pot it with soil the whole way down. The roots actually love it. They will grow throughout the whole pot easier versus hitting weird pieces of cut crockery and rocks and down here and having to grow through that. So I generally don't put drainage layers except Sometimes for these succulents that I want to make sure there's a nice little extra barrier, because it's going to be such a minimal amount of water that this gets. This is going to be a plant on a diet. She's someone who's like, she counts her calories. We're going to be very aware of how much water we give this plant. Sometimes I will keep little little teacups or little like old shot glasses on my windowsill and like in the bathroom. And that's what I use to fill and water a plant like this. I literally know you are getting maybe 2 ounces of liquid once a month, and that's it. So this practice right here is maybe a little bit more like, you're going to kind of watch it a little bit more than like coming back to it a month later and going, oh, what are you doing? You know that maybe once a week, or if it's in a very sunny space, once a week, or if it's in a less sunny, more filtered light space, a plant like in this setup might need water once a month. But if you skipped a month, it will not be happy, and she'll let you know. So now that we put our drainage rock down at the bottom, and it's just maybe 1/4 of an inch, not a lot, I'm going to put in enough soil at the base so that when I put my plant on top, I want to know, where is this going to sit? Do I want it to look kind of like demure and small in this pot? If I do that, there's nothing wrong with it. It means though that this plant is going to have less space to grow into sooner. So I will have to revisit potting that plant sooner. If I pot it way too high, jades have very shallow root systems, so it won't be able to make good use of that very minimal amount of water that I put in there, because it's not going to send, you probably can see from here, this is what it was in before. It's not going to send long, long roots all the way through this whole pot. That's something to keep in mind with succulents. So I'm going to put it right where the base of the root ball is about maybe 1/4 of an inch below this pot. If it was a larger pot, like a 4-inch or 6-inch or 8-inch pot, I might use like my thumb as a guide, like 1 inch or so. So like 1 inch below the rim, 2 inches below the rim. And the reason I want to be aware of where I'm placing in this pot is when I water it, I don't want that water to overflow. So now I'm kind of holding it steady so it's centered. I'm going to go ahead, pot around there. I'm going to pat down to help remove any air pockets, any voids. And you'll notice if you do have a void when you go to water, if ever you water like a freshly potted plant, and then all of a sudden there's this gaping hole in one spot, it means there was an air pocket or a void there. And so then you can put more dirt. It just needs more dirt in that spot. So I'm going to give this a press. Now, here's the thing. You will notice when I potted this plant, everything is dry. Succulents store water in their leaves. So I don't need to worry about watering her right off the bat. She has enough water in her leaves to make it till the next time I would routinely water her. If ever the leaves are wrinkly, they're really flat, they're limp, then that's the time that, oh, she has no water in her leaves, I need to give her water. One of the reasons we stick to using dry ingredients when we pot a succulent is a lot of times you're making a fresh cut or a wound on the plant. And it's really important for succulents that when you, give myself a little space again, when you are potting them, that wound is shut. Because succulents store their water in their leaves and branches, if this is a point of entry, possible point of entry for like infection, you know, we want to make sure that this wound heals well first and then pot it. So if I was going to take a cutting, how I started with this one, I would take, there's 2 ways to do it for a succulent. And this is a burrow's tail. Actually, this is just a sedum. This isn't the burrow's tail family, but it's a sedum is the basic name of the family. And so that cut edge, I would actually let this callus over for a day. I have little like cups of cuttings. Like you can see the same thing with our snake plant that we talked about before, that I would let this plant callus over before submerging it into anything moist. And so to be sure that you are not going to introduce any bad bacteria. You, one, let it callus, and two, when you do go to pot it over that next day or so, you use all dry ingredients. Let's see, I want to show you. I want to show you guys that let's say you have got your cutting and you're like, okay, I've got a cutting. It has no root ball. It's just this branch of something. So this branch will become this. If you can see that. If anyone can't see, I can explain it to you a little more what it is. This branch is rooting out throughout the entirety of the main stem. So unlike our tropical plant that maybe has that node and it has that Y section where the aerial roots grow, a lot of succulents, every part of the succulent wants to grow a new plant. Every part has a blueprint to make a new baby plant. So this branch can actually be potted, and these hairs that are holding onto the dirt are called rootlets. This is called, this isn't called a plantlet. Let me find you a good one that's a plantlet. A plantlet is, oh, here's a cutie pie. This is one single leaf. Make sure I can show you an example. It's one single leaf. So you can see there, that little teeny like oval shape is growing a stem off of it. And there's teeny little pink hairs at the base. This is called a plantlet. It is the most small plant, right? This plant will grow and grow and grow into a plant like this. So what's so cool about propagating succulents is that they really like are prolific growers and they're fertile. They want to make lots of babies. So if you ever knock one in your house and like a few leaves break off, I will take these leaves and just place them on top of the dry soil. Again, they don't need to be watered. They don't need to be buried like a seed. You literally tuck them in. And that's what we use saucers like this for at our space, is we'll have shallow saucers with dry potting mix, and we tuck the roots in. Maybe I would say once a month, it gets a quick drink of water and the rootlets will start to grow. And that's the beginning of the plant. And once it gets to a certain size, we pot it up maybe into a 2-inch pot, then a 3-inch pot, and then it's an actual new plant again. Does anyone have any questions about succulents? Something came up. Okay, no worries. No worries. Everyone's good on succulents. Cool. I am going to show you then some fun ones. Now, everyone probably is maybe familiar with potting mix, but there are actual, like some other ways of growing, propagating as a grow medium, like moss and Lecka. So what we're going to do with moss, and that's how I use moss. I use moss for plants that generally for more tropical plants for sure. Plants that are native to maybe Southeast Asia, Central America, South America, subtropics of Florida, and they grow aerial roots. What I tend to find with tropical plants is they don't necessarily need to stay in a heavy, damp potting mix like a calathea might, but an aroid plant, it's a separate, its own family of plants that includes Monstera, Philodendron, and Anthurium. They grow aerial roots. They're used to kind of growing in the valleys by rivers, in the nooks of trees, and they are used to climbing and having to kind of set their little aerial roots, these hair-like roots, and making use of the resources around them. So what's nice about moss is if ever you have a very special aroid plant that you're like, I don't want to risk root rot propagating this, and where it's going to be way too soggy and wet. So I want something that's very airy, and just creates a higher humidity around that very new node. Moss is a great one to do it. So this is an example of, which one is this? This is a Gloriosum. So this is a Philodendron Gloriosum. And I think there's actually 2 stems in the same pot. These pots are really popular right now. in like the aroid world, just because you can see the roots, you kind of see what's going on. But I have a mix in here of vermiculite and sphagnum moss. And there are different grades of sphagnum moss. So some sphagnum moss is going to have lots of sticks in it. If you buy it like from the pet store, you can totally, it's sphagnum moss, it will work. There's also forest moss. You want to make sure what's in it and that doesn't have any, like, tag along friends. You cannot use the moss from your backyard as different moss. This moss is usually long fiber, is what they'll call it, from Chile or New Zealand. It's really popular for orchids. Is there more substantial medium? Could someone read that one for me? Because it cuts off at the end there.
Sure.
Is there
more substantial medium to use this way than sphagnum?
More substantial, I would say.
Sorry, that was supposed to be sustainable.
Oh, sustainable than sphagnum. Yes. Well, you have to be probably pretty good about where you're sourcing things from. My mom was a hand spinner and a knitter and dragged us to many a farm to find stuff. And so she would grow things in her garden to dye with, because she started getting really particular about, the dyes in our clothing and stuff. And so I would say if you're the most particular, you kind of, it's almost a sliding scale, because perlite has the same problem, that there is, it's a finite resource and the means of harvesting it has a cost and has a footprint that affects the environment. So what some people I've heard do is there is something called like sisal straw. And sisal straw is, you see it the most in gift boxes. So at this time of year, like going into holidays, you ever see those little square boxes with like it's like a cheese box or a wine box, and there's like the white kind of like hay straw around it. Sisal straw is nice because if it gets wet, it doesn't rot. So it can last a long time. And it's a straw. So it's more something that kind of in its life cycle can be kind of grown and harvested and turned over a little faster. And what I like about it is it doesn't break down. You will notice even with moss that it's not as if you compost, it's going to break down. Sphagnum moss breaks down into peat moss over a long time and a bigger process. But even in your garden, if you were like, oh, I can try and reuse this, after a point, you really can't. So you're going to have to kind of get creative. What I do think a lot of people do to get creative about sustainability is something like Lecka. Lecka stands for, it's an acronym. It's L-E-C-A. And it looks like Cocoa Puffs. That's what it looks like. It looks like Cocoa Puffs. Lecka is light, expanded clay aggregate. So L-E-C-A, and you just call it Lecka. And lots of people who are like not fans of having so much soil in their house, or they're just not, but that's just not something that they enjoy doing, is like the potting part of their plants, they will grow in Lecka. If you grow in Lecka, two big things to keep in mind, which is wonderful, because like this is a very sustainable product. You can buy it and reuse it indefinitely. And we're big about reusing because it's so hard to always, grow your own. This is like, we get stuff from like, Ecuador. So it flew on a plane here. So we talk about sustainability. We're like, well, at least if it can make one trip, if we can get the most uses out of this item, you kind of feel like that's the part you can contribute and do. So that's what's cool about Lecka. What's tricky about Lecka is two things. When you first get it, I would highly recommend you do a good big soak and there are very trace amounts of salts from the production process of Lecka. And a good example is, I brought it. And you might notice this too sometimes in your, let's see, like your fertilizers, but like, it'll have this like white fuzziness to it. That's just salt. So sometimes you're like, okay, I have to kind of like either clean my Lecka again. The best way to avoid having excess salts affecting your plant is to really rinse your Lecka well. Sometimes if I buy a small enough bag of it, I will just poke holes in the bag on the bottom and open the top and let water run through the entire bag in my bathtub. Or we have like colanders and just, like cooking drainage things. And we just dump it in there and use the great big sink and just let the water flush all those salts out. The other trick with Lecka is because you're using this as your growing medium, there are no organic nutrients happening. There is, even with sphagnum moss, it breaks down, it's organic, right? Lecka has been very processed, so, and it's not going to break down. So in order to get those trace, like those nutrients that a plant would get from being, potted or, in dirt, you have to then add it. So people who work with Lecka, you get really good about using a liquid diluted fertilizer in very small amounts. Usually it's a natural one, so it's a very low NPK ratio, so that, again, we're trying to avoid excess salts because it's not going anywhere. It's not draining out the bottom of the pot. It is a vessel. And then the other thing is the pH. Because it has the salts in it and you're adding fertilizer, you want to then be mindful that your philodendrons like a certain pH to be the most happy. So then you kind of realize at a certain point, you're like, it's not growing anymore, or why are the leaves so yellow? That's when you might want to get a pH testing, some strips, and just kind of see what level you're at, and if anything needs to be adjusted. But I do like Lecka. I was going to show you guys. So this, I think that root can go. That's probably the oldest root there. So this was an aerial root. And then all this white stuff is the new roots. And this is 2 nodes that have been submerged. Someone asked about that, right? So this is 2 nodes. This cutting is a Monstera albo. It's a variegated Monstera deliciosa. So it has white splotches and everything across it. So I wanted to make sure that we plan on selling this in the shop. So I want to make sure that the person who gets it really feels comfortable that like it's an established plant they're getting. So I did do a larger cutting of 2 nodes for this one. And what's nice is they did take, I'm probably going to trim off that old aerial root. And what you will notice too, if you do this at home, one, the Lecka will stick to your roots a little bit there. And because it has that kind of porous surface to it. So a plant like an aroid, like a Monstera or Philodendron, they do love growing in it, and they have thicker roots. It grows throughout the Lecka really well. But your aerial roots, the brown, long roots that are usually hanging like mid-air off your plant, when you submerge them in a Lecka mix or your water propagation, the aerial root will go from that dark color to a white color and produce actual new roots that you can pot the plant with. So that's that guy. And so that was what I was going to show you before. This is also Lecka. I loved this jar. I loved this jar when I got it, except it's in a very sunny spot. So the algae also loves it. So this project, it's more like now I have a new pet that I have to clean every like 10 days because it turns back into this. So, and I know people who, if you are a very fastidious, like every single day you're maintaining your garden a certain way and you're like, I make sure that the curtains are closed so that there's not too much light on my glass vessels, then that's fine. But if you're someone who's kind of like, I want to come and go with my plants a bit, then I prefer to stick to an opaque vessel, and you don't have that problem at all. Does anyone have any questions about Lecka? Has anyone tried it? They're like, no, but maybe I'll look it up. We sell Lecka at our shop, but you can totally find it all kinds of places online. Big, too scared. No, I would say try it, especially if you have a friend who it has some and they can give you some, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's less of a commitment. Part of this hobby is the experimentation. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes we have a down week and we forget to water everything, right? And so sometimes or can we grow in Lecka? No, you can grow in Lecka for sure. As far as experimenting, this is why we experiment, to see what works and to learn something new, right? So if you get a cutting, you could just, that's literally what this is. This was just, I had a really long branch on an elbow. I was like, it's here, we can only keep so much. So I'm like, I'm gonna cut you, we're gonna start a new plant. It was a cutting, I let it callus for tropical aroids because they come from the rainforest. And even though they don't like super damp soil, they do like a humid environment. I didn't want, and the leaves are paper thin. That is always a good indication of how much do you need to let this plant callus before putting it in a water propagation or potting it right up. If it has paper thin leaves, it's not storing any of its own water. And you'll notice when they start to curl, that they're getting dehydrated. If ever they droop, if they look like a thirsty person, then they're thirsty. So when it comes to cutting, I will cut this and I let it callus. I let that end callus and scar over like for 30 minutes, maybe an hour, but like that's it generally. And I got some fresh Lecka, rinsed it off, filled up my vest, this is just a vase, and stuck it in there. This is probably, this cutting, I want to say maybe 2 months old, but it's totally ready to be potted. So I could pot it up tonight and send it over to the shop. Has anyone ever tried the moss propagating, especially for like nodes trying to save a rehab project? Like maybe debated it. And I'll show you what I'm talking about when I rehab for propagating. So I think it was a really leggy, just ordered green moss. So green moss is going to be that forest moss. And again, in a pinch, you work with what you have and it could do it. But sphagnum moss is probably going to make certain plants happier. And the thing you'll notice with green moss is it really does get green. So the algae thing with green moss, and even sphagnum moss will do it too. The top will turn like bright green because algae is growing on it. And if it starts to get like unsightly to you, that's when you want to just refreshen your sphagnum moss. But this is me making a mess. They came, I don't know where I got them from. I got them from somewhere. I don't think it was a happy plant. And so I think what I did is I cut it up. So like this chunk where my fingers are is the main stem. This little horn is the new branch starting. And because I wanted to be very more considerate about the amount of water this gets, because remember, aeroids don't like to be waterlogged at all, even though they like humidity. So I was like, I need something that is absorbent but airy. And that's what sphagnum moss can be. So I actually tucked two in together. And the reason I tucked two in together is I have some over there. I wish maybe I'll grab one to show you. But I have these size pots, maybe as like a 2 ounce, or like a 2 inch tall cup. Something that small will dry out faster, which means you have to be more mindful of it. Something this size, there's more volume for the water to disperse through. So by putting two of the cuttings in together, there's more roots making use of the humidity and the moisture in the pot this size. I would not probably have put one in by itself, a pot this large that has such little roots. I mean, now it's getting better. It's a little more respectful looking. But when it was like just a little stump, I probably would have had something a little smaller by itself and nestled it right on top. Something else I love to use is to-go cups, because it's the same idea. It's a clear cup. You can kind of see what's going on with the roots on, as it progresses. But what's nice about to-go cups that have maybe a domed lid, or even a dessert cup that have a domed lid, is it's a way to help increase the humidity for that node to send out more roots to grow into a more established plant. So I will use to-go cups. Oh, where is it? One of my favorite, I think a friend suggested this. You can, and I'll say, if you have a grow space in your house and you use like 10-20 trays, like the black nursery trays, they do make plastic domes of different heights. They make super shallow ones, very, very tall ones for taller plants, that you can dome those nursery trays to increase the humidity around the plant without having to always be watering it. But if you're kind of like, I don't have enough space for that, or I don't like the way that looks where I have available to put a plant, I don't want to see that. I got this, I believe, off of Amazon. This is a shoebox. I think it was for heels. I love it. We will put, we'll start a layer of charcoal, horticultural charcoal at the base. I'll put Lecka above that, and then sphagnum moss. And we love this, especially for like Hoyas, because Hoyas don't need to be in a very wet potting mix. They definitely want to dry out or they will get root rot, but they want high humidity. So something like this, it has no air holes. No air holes. There's not a lot of airflow. The airflow comes from opening and exposing, getting fresh air in there. But a plant that likes really high humidity would love something like this. Plants that you're like, I have grown molds when I have tried that before. That might mean you want more airflow for that plant or that setup. And that's when the to-go cups or salad containers, if you buy like strawberries or berries, those are great packaging to reuse and get like, a second life out of it before you recycle it or throw it away, because they already have little vents and holes in them. They're already kind of inclined towards produce. And you go ahead and just put a thin layer, like maybe an inch or two layer of sphagnum moss. You're going to get it wet first and squeeze out the excess. So it's damp, but it's not sitting in a soup, if that makes sense. And you're going to line the bottom of your container and you kind of tuck your node on top. You don't need to bury it. This has a lot of roots, so that's why this is more buried. I have some that they're literally just kind of laying, reclining across the top of their moss or barely tucked in. And then you close that lid and that increased humidity is going to increase your root growth. Does anyone have questions about propagating containers? I'm the queen of trying to reuse a container. It's propagated. These are good there. So I was going to show you some different plants. I feel like pothos and snake plants are some of the easier plants. When you come across, do you need to remove? I cannot see the end of that question. So give me 1 second. I think someone will read it for me. But I was going to tell you, the most common, I think, plants people start off with for propagating and cutting are like the snake plants and pothos, because they kind of have them and it's growing well. So you're like, now it's a lot. Can I make a cutting? I think Monstera were one of my favorites to start with. Because Monstera deliciosa is a really hardy Monstera. There's a wide family of Monstera, but of them, that's probably the hardiest, that they can kind of go through long periods of drying out, and they kind of enjoy drying out between watering. So if you are new to it and there's a bit of trial error going on, they're very forgiving. And they love all of the propagation methods. They love the moss, they love water, they love Lecka. Before I had my own shop and I was just, in my backyard playing around, I would take cuttings and just get like 4 and 6 inch pots going with some root growth hormone right off the bat in my backyard. And then I would wait about 4 to 6 weeks. When you see new growth is when you know that that propagation is a happy one. But some other ones that are fun to play with that people have access to, I want to show you guys. And if someone could, Heather, if you could read that question for me.
Sure. It says, when you lay it across, do you need to remove all leaves?
No. So before I say this, I will show you. So this is, and one of my favorite tricks for anybody who's a laid back gardener, a label maker will change your life, because once you start doing this, you will not remember what this was, especially with a plant that looks one way as juvenile and another way as an adult or as a stick. You'll be like, I have no idea what this is. So label maker's your friend. This is a Philodendron Beauty green. So it's just a Philodendron, what is it? Oh gosh, Florida is what the common name of it is. And then the Beauty is like the variegated one. But we wanted to make sure that we keep track of which one it is. So this was just a cutting that I believe I started off in moss. And what you want is you want to keep the leaves, because the leaves help the plant produce food. The leaves help the plant produce chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is how it makes sugar to feed itself, right? It's not like 100% dependent upon us fertilizing it as a plant. It uses the light we give it. So if you don't have any leaves, this is going to take much longer to get to a full-fledged plant stage versus this plant already comes with its own little powerhouse to get started growing roots. And that's what you want. You want to kind of go, wow, as soon as, and I see new growth here. So this is my clue as someone who sells plants too. I'm like, I want to make sure I'm not just selling a cutting, right? Once it starts to get potted and you can't see all of the nodes and the aerial roots anymore, then I look for the new growth to be like, aha, we've got new growth going on. This one, I think she's actually ready to go to the shop too. So that's a good sign that we've got some good established roots to support a very perky plant. If you don't have leaves, what usually happens when you don't have leaves, that means you maybe ordered a node of a very cool plant, which I'm excited for you if you did that. And you're like, I ordered a stick, Nika. That's all I got. And the thing, that means you're going to baby it. You're going to, nestle it in that humidity. And it will grow a leaf first, generally, and then it will root out from there. The roots sometimes they'll happen at the same time, but you'll notice that the leaves will be very small. And what you want is to make sure that your stick still looks green. It still looks alive. If it starts to look black, mushy, like a weird shade of brown, like decay, or like jerky, like it's dried, it's brittle, that means that that stick is no longer with us. And that experiment and learning opportunity is over. It's time for a new learning opportunity. But I wanted to show you some other plants that you usually can find them around in a home, but people I think are less inclined to start there for propagating. And this is such a fun one. This is Addressina. Oh my gosh, which one are you? So this is the mom. Mom is back here. And mom came to us and she needed a haircut. She was she looked like a tired mom who'd seen a lot. So we wanted to clean her up a bit. But so then now you have these cuttings, right? And if you aren't used to propagating, you might say, okay, maybe I'll keep it in water or treat it like a flower, but I'm just going to throw it away after a while. This actually will grow into a whole new plant. And when you buy Addressina, sometimes they're called dragon tree plants too. You can find them at big box stores sometimes. And they'll be staggered heights or they're braided together. What they're doing when they have more than one in the same pot is this. They literally just have more than one stem potted in the same pot. So you could do the same thing at your own, your home. What you'll notice is when you cut it, first when you cut it, I'm sharing my learning moment with you. Now this one, first when you cut it, you're going to take all the leaves off that are going to be submerged in water because they're just going to decay and make your water grow faster and harbor bacteria. So go ahead and get those leaves off. All of these nubs, the bumps where leaves were, those are nodes. So you're going to leave it in. I feel like in a good conditions, maybe 4 to 6 weeks to get some little roots growing. I think I'm just at 4 weeks for these guys. What you'll notice over time, I know probably it's very hard to see here, but there are these like white lumps, white growths starting on the stalk. Those are the beginnings of new roots. So on our Instagram, we have a couple of like videos of just water propagations of what does this look like rooted out in a vase. And it's a plant you usually don't see treated that way. But if you have access to one or you have one that you're like, I totally cut this thing and prune it all the time, I could be making my own plants. That's how. One caveat I'm going to share is if you get into it and you're like, I am trimming all the plants, I love it, especially like if it's a jade, it's something where you trim it and it was leggy. Leggy means there was a lot of stretch between the growth points, between the leaves. There was a lot of space between the leaves. And you see that a lot maybe in plants in like dark like stores, like a bank or something where you're like, that poor plant, that pothos is 18 feet long with 4 leaves on it because she's stretching for light. That's called exfoliation, is the stretching. And what you will notice with so if you go to trim and cut, the problem will happen with this. Like if I had cut this branch and this branch was 30 inches, like if I was doing something where I wanted to make the main branch, the main stem branch into multiple branches, that's why I cut this off. So now this is my extra cutting, but it's so long, right? And maybe you're like, I don't really need something this long on my table. I wish it was a little shorter. I could actually cut this again and propagate 2 pieces. The problem is one has leaves on it, one doesn't. And the only reason it's a problem is I know the top of the stem with leaves because it has leaves on it. If I cut this and I put this down and I go make coffee and I come back and I'm like, which end, because there's no leaves, right? Which end was the top? And if I propagate it or bury it, like pot it upside down, the plant is like, no, I don't do that. I don't grow upside down. So then you'll be like, I tried the thing and it didn't work and it just turned into sticks and dirt and it doesn't work for me. A trick I'll use is to just take a permanent marker and at the bottom inch or 2 of a plant that doesn't have any leaves on it, especially if I'm going to pot it right in soil or something, is to go ahead and make an arrow facing up. And I know that sounds super basic, but it really is helpful, especially if you're like doing like a late night Netflix gardening session and you got, you know what I mean? You got a lot going on, you ordered food or like you're doing, and then you realize you're just like, oh, I don't remember which way is which. So that's just a quick thing. And you could do that with any plant. So your jades, anything that where you're like, I can't remember which way is up, make a note for yourself on your plant. And then it's just helpful. Let's see. Oh, and then will you please also position on pruning? Pruning's how we get here. So yes, pruning is super fun. There was a question before the pruning one that I want to make sure I go back to. Heather, can you read that one more time?
Sure. It was, how do you know, other than looking it up, what plant will root from water and which ones need soil?
Actually, I can't think of a plant that doesn't grow from water propagation. The trick with a succulent, and let me show you, give me one sec. Oh, do I have a good one? Addressina. Yes. This is a great example. Aha. So this little guy, I don't even see it so well. I know it's being so cluttered. It's very intimate right now. Plants. So this is a plant in the Sansevieria family. I'm not sure of the exact species because she's a wee baby, and we rely on Google Lens. So if you have Google Photo, there's Google Lens is one of the tools. You take a photo, you tap the Google Lens, and it will tell you all the other photos it can find on the internet that look like this. And that is a wonderful way to start to get really specific about what kind of Sansevieria is this one. So this guy doesn't have a stem, right? It doesn't have this long stem we can stick in water. What some people will do, and I think we used to this when we first opened, we used to sell water propagations, which is super tricky in the store because it's like you're leaving with a vase of water and a stem, right? But what we had is vintage Coke bottles. So old Coke bottles. And what you could do with a plant like this is if you have just the base of it or just the roots, the little, because it's very shallow roots for a succulent, you have it at the top of the vessel, but the vessel has a narrow opening. Sometimes you'll see things called propagation discs. They almost look like little saucers that have a hole in the center. But those are the fancy ones. We sell some of those too. But like you could do ones like even cardboard with a hole cut in it. And you make sure that the cardboard disc fits on top of your glass. And then the roots of your very shallow succulent fit into that hole. And when you go to fill it up with water, the goal isn't to fill up your vessel the entire way with water. It's to create some humidity in there for these roots to grow down. So we used to do this with Coke bottles. And we would have them, and you know, it kind of looked cool. So we're like, okay, we're gonna put this in there and the plant will grow because it's got contact with enough moisture. And what's neat about succulents, because they don't need to literally be sitting in water, it would take a really long time for the roots to make contact with the water. Tropical cuttings, all right, answer that in a second. So you can totally do it. I find the best ones that work for succulents is something like a propagation disc or something that has a narrow opening. Think of like if anyone's ever propagated like an avocado or something, it's like you maybe almost have it hovering above the liquid versus being submerged like this in the liquid. Even jade, you could probably, the hardier the stem, more of a stem there is to work with, you could put it in water. But even these little guys, you can still do the same thing. For the tropical Ticalus, because it has thin papery leaves and because it comes from a rainforest high humidity environment natively, they don't like to dry out as much as a cactus or succulent does as a cutting. So while I don't even know when I cut this. I don't know when I cut this, but yeah, you can totally tell it's like white, it's shrunken back. But this is still a firm leaf. It has enough water in this leaf from like the week ago or whenever I cut this, that it's still a happy leaf, but there's no open wound. For a tropical plant like a philodendron or a monstera anthurium, I would only let it callus like for maybe 30 minutes to an hour. Some people, we have a video on our Instagram. We have a 12-foot monstera that we did an air layer propagation with. And that is where you take moss and an aeroid mix, and instead of cutting, you build a pot around the main stem so that the aerial roots grow into that pot, and you basically have two plants attached by this main stem, if that makes sense, before you make the cut. So our monstera was 12 feet tall. My store is only 12 feet tall. So I was supposed to cut it in April, but then we got this space and I was like, I got distracted. So then suddenly I think it was like August and it was a Saturday when we were open, and there's totally a video online of like me quickly sawing on this 12-foot tree between people in the shop to get it out and to get it into my Prius. But what's neat is I reached out to somebody in Florida who specializes in large form monsteras, because that's what that one is. The leaves get like 3 feet across. They're huge. And she was like, don't let it callus. This plant is so big and the leaves are so big and it's so papery thin, it needs water ASAP. So even though Monstera deliciosa are apathetic, they like to dry out between watering, and they like to climb, and they might even lose contact with the ground and send aerial roots all the way down to the ground. She was like, if you leave it out for a day and come back, you will come back to a very sad, dehydrated plant. So that's something to keep in mind, that the more papery, I always think that's always a good guide, that no matter if it's a prayer plant, ficus, a monstera, the more papery the leaves, the less water it is storing on its own. So it needs to get back into water sooner. I think that cuttings. Oh, that sounds so pretty though. Why didn't they, what did they do? Did they just die back? Yes, I'm sorry. So, I've never rooted vinca, but my husband planted it, and I regret that because it grows everywhere. So I would imagine it could be prolific. The only thing I could think of is that they are used to, especially like if you have a fire bush, or I don't know if it's the same as a smoke bush, but like that they were used to more light. And then if you then brought them into like the dining room or somewhere and it wasn't bright enough for them, then it doesn't matter all the water you're giving it, they're not actually utilizing it. And it's tricky. I know everyone hates to figure out like, when is it overwatering, when is it underwatering? And it can be really hard to discern the difference because in propagation, they're just sitting in water, right? But if I have this sitting in water in a very dark room, it's not going to be able to make energy to utilize the water it's being given, right? So if the leaves died back soft, limp, like they didn't even like get that light crunchy brown, they turned dark and wilted flat and soggy, then that probably meant it wasn't getting enough light. If you start it earlier in the spring next year, like once it starts to grow in and then you start getting some cuttings going, I do that with some different ferns that I'm like, I don't think you can make a Chicago winter. I'm gonna pull you out and then I will get some going in pots, and they kind of go back and forth from my house, from pots to the yard, back to pots. That makes sense. I missed that last question, I'm sorry. Did someone ask one? Nope, okay. So I wanna show you one other plant, and Heather's gonna keep me honest on my time, so I don't cover for you guys. This one is, this is how sad this is. It says Anthurium. There's like 2,000 Anthurium in that species or that family. Which species this is, I would have to get out the mother plant somewhere. Like, what did I cut you off of? I think I know where I came from. But so this is a juvenile form. This is not what the grown-up version of this Anthurium looks like. But what you will, if you ever get Anthuriums that get the red leaf, the red spathe, sometimes they're called Dutch Anthuriums. Anthuriums are so much fun to propagate. They have really hardy roots. The more common ones, they grow so well. They're so much fun to kind of like test out ideas and test out what works. So all this was this is the main stem. That was the petiole to the leaf. There was a little aerial root. And now, I don't want to break her, but she's got probably like a 1.5 inch long little white hairy root in there. And this lives on, we have a bookshelf around the corner here. So we actually have like a collection of like vintage glass and a plant that you kind of think like, especially if you find yourself buying it like every summer, like every year, you're like, I love that plant. I'm gonna buy it every time I see it. If it's doing well, that's a great time to try and propagate it and to get backups of some of your favorite plants. So we have mother plants here, but then what we'll do is get multiple mother plants going. So we have a little like working moms division. So there's like the Monstera working moms. We have like probably 4 elbow plants. We have probably 3 philodendron. I'm looking right now. What is this? Not Ring of Fire. It's not a Ring of Fire. The other one, the sawtooth one. But like you have all these collections of mother plants going as insurance that just in case, you know, a family member knocks over your favorite plant, just in case someone leaves a window open and kills a favorite plant, you now have some backup of that plant. I think did anyone ask the question in a moment? I might've missed it.
I was going to tell you that you were absolutely right about the fire bush. I had it sitting with the coleus because the coleus is like shade. And so when I was doing the cutting, I had it in shade. So I will go try more sun. Thank you.
No, totally. In our house, because like this place where I'm at right now it's like work. I love it. I'm not complaining. This is pretty, right? I'm not complaining, but it's my job. I don't live here. So I have a few things that are here that are really special to me. And I was finding that there might be 2 or 3 days that I wasn't here. And if they didn't get watered right, you know, you're like, oh, you're not getting the attention I kind of want you to get. So I'm turning my dining room into a separate new little grow space with my family's blessing. One of the things we did as a test run to make sure everybody, the kids, the cat, the husband, everybody was on the same page, is we set up a little grow space on a desk. One of my favorite things to do is to get a normal looking lamp, a house lamp, but put a grow bulb in it. So a lot of people feel like they kind of have to go, you know, you go on Amazon or a big box store and they look at these grow lights, they kind of look really mechanically looking or very like industrial looking. And instead I think I went to maybe like IKEA, or we had a vintage lamp. It's super basic, it's a black lamp, but I changed out the bulb to something that's lends itself more to a grow for growing plants. And everything we put there was so happy. And this is we're in a bungalow. Like, we don't have a lot of lights naturally in the house. So doing that, even plants that kind of needed more light naturally, is there a brand you recommend? Oh, for grow lights, I would say what I would recommend, I think I'm doing my due diligence as a plant person and someone who sells plants, to say, instead of getting hung up on the brand, because there's some ones that kind of pitch towards houseplant owners, but they're very pricey. And then there's some really like basic ones where you're like, that's just not pretty. I don't want that in my house. What I would look for is learn what a plant would want. Learn about light temperature. There's something called PAR, and that's the amount of energy that a light puts out. So I tend to go for light temperature, and I tend to go for LED lights. I'm not growing anything that needs really, really intense high light. So because it comes from the rainforest, like just being near light is going to be happy. So when I think I maybe right at home, we might be using just like basically GE, grow light bulbs. You want to make sure, this is one thing I will tell you, is LEDs tend to be really well in general. They work well. What is really lighting our shelves over here, I wish you could see it. I think we have a video online about it, but like, we use LED bars on the plant shelves. So that's what's lighting up the plants around me. But I think at home, they're just GE grow bulbs, but you want to make sure you're getting a grow bulb and not something that's called a plant bulb. And you're like, really? They did that? Why would they do that? I know. And here's the only difference. There's some reason some company makes bulbs that are green toned or blue toned. They are toned to make plants look more aesthetically pleasing, but basically it's just a basic light bulb. And that's all it is. The problem is the price tag. You think you're investing in a grow light to help your plant grow larger and more robust, and it's not doing that at all. So you want to make sure you read the back and read what it actually says, what it does. Most grow bulbs will very prominently say it. They will talk about the light spectrum that they use. Is it, pink lights? I prefer warm white because I feel like I have to live with my plants, and that's more comfortable to me. It looks more normal, right? But if you're like, I love a pink light, I don't mind it, then that's totally fine. But learning about light temperature, and you can just Google it, go on YouTube and be like, okay, grow light temperature. And there's some really straightforward videos I would kind of gravitate towards. And then if you get really into it, or you have a really big, like a greenhouse and you're trying to get like vegetables going, that kind of thing, there are definitely videos that get way more in depth. I think someone asked one more question there. I might have missed it, Heather.
Is it best to propagate a pineapple top in soil or water?
Ooh, I've seen it done both. I haven't done, my kids grow all the food stuff, which is hilarious because they're into that. I have to stick to more of my tropicals. I would say, from what I've seen, you can definitely do soil. I think what you find is you're going to get particular about how wet does it need to stay? Like, how quickly does that soil need to dry out for your propagation? And that might take some trial and error. That if you're just using some standard potting mix that you have around the house, and you feel like the leaves are dying before you need to rewater it, it might be a matter that that mix is too wet because there's no roots really to make use of all the moisture there yet. And so maybe you want to try something that is more airy. That helps. You're welcome. So does anyone have any other plant questions that they kind of like, this is what I'm working with? You need any help?
We did miss one back when we were talking about water propagation. They were asking about water roots and if it link suggestions on how long to keep them in water so that they don't get too reliant on water.
So I'm a laid back gardener. I always specify because I have friends that are like, they're like scientists, you know, and I'm always like, oh my gosh, your poor plant's going like to the most chill house when it comes back with me. So I love to kind of, if it looks good in its vessel, like this maybe has been in here for a month, but I think it's kind of pretty. So I would keep this in here for a really long time. And luckily it's a slow growing plant. So it's only got 1 to 2 inches of root growth as it is. In general, most people will say having a minimum of 2 inches of growth from water propagation is the minimum to get it in soil. Less than that, and there's not a lot of root to support so much plant to make use of the moisture from the potting mix, if that makes sense. What I tend to do is I will, this guy, I have a lot of these. I probably have like 30 of these floating around just this space here. So if I have like this root is what, 7 inches, 8 inches long, I could absolutely pot this. And I probably would pot it in a slightly smaller pot so that I'm watering more often so that it's not such a shock. That's probably the biggest difference. And people talk about water roots versus soil roots. I don't think it's so much that the root isn't tough enough to handle going into soil. I think the root is still used to certain conditions. So if you can mimic more of those conditions when you're making that transfer, if you can put it in a more absorbent potting mix for that plant, it might be happier than all of a sudden going from this to, hey, this lady never waters me. And then you're like, well, it wasn't the water roots that died. It went from all the water to no water. So if you ever, when you buy plants at like really big nurseries, sometimes you might notice that they come potted like in 100% peat moss. And I'm like, really? Like what? It's only peat moss because it is like, that is just sponge. It is the most sponge. And plants like prayer plants have very, where is there one here again? This guy. They have very fine, hairy leaves versus an aroid that has like thick, like almost like spider tarantula kind of, not leaves, I'm sorry, roots. They have very, aroids have very thick roots, and a plant like a prayer plant, Stromanthes, Calatheas, Marantas, they have very fine paper roots. A lot of peperomia have very, very fine, papery, thin hair-like roots. And the leaves themselves are thin and papery. Everything about this plant says, you need to give me water. I do not keep water. So then when I were to take this out of water propagation and pot it, I'm not going to use the same mix I would use for a succulent. I'm going to use something that retains moisture a little bit more. And that's why it's nice to know that you can either make your own from scratch, your own potting mix. I was very cheap. That's how I got started making potting mix. I just looked at the prices of things and I'd be like, I'm just going to make my own stuff. That's what I'm going to do. I'm play trial and error. So I might make one that's very peat or cocoa coir heavy for this plant versus very perlite heavy for a succulent. I hope that helps. What are some good ways to increase humidity? Oh, I love this. This is a good one because I think especially it's so much easier in a smaller space. Look, we're in this huge grow space and this is gonna be our first winter. It's very dry in general, right? In this space. So we're gonna be like, we're gonna be using all the tricks. My store, I have been in that space as one business or another for almost 3 or 4 years now, I think. And what I find I loved was I like more passive ways of growing things. So one of the first ones I jumped to was a pebble tray. And a pebble tray is literally just as simple as you could use Lecka, but even just like literally gravel from a building supply store or river rock, aquarium rocks, pebbles at the bottom of the tray. So when you are using, let's say this is an empty tray and this is my nursery pot and I'm going to put it on here. And when I water, the water drains into this tray. Instead of sitting it into the tray, where now the bottom of that pot is setting into the tray by 1 inch or 2, I would fill this tray up with little river pebbles and then set the pot on top. This does two things. One, when I go to water it and the water drains out, at no point is this pot sitting in the pool of water. And that's not a rule. It's a rule we can either bend or break. So how your home conditions are, if it's super dry, you might be like, I need all the water these plants can get. So I don't care about them sitting in it. But if you're kind of like, I want to increase humidity, but I don't want my succulents sitting in wet puddles of water, like after I've watered, right? And I don't want to have to empty all these trays of water. So by filling it up with pebbles, the water stays with the pebbles, the plant sits on top. What this does is, and this is super cool, there's some really cool YouTube videos on it. There's a certain surface elasticity that happens over the surface of the aggregate of the pebbles, the rocks, the Lecka. So instead of it just being a flat, smooth puddle of water, it will evaporate even slower if it is stretched over the surface of things. And the more things it's stretched over, the slower it will evaporate, which means that the ambient humidity around that pot is boosted. This is not going to replace the humidifier. It's not going to replace the humidifier, but this is one way of helping to boost humidity throughout your home without relying 100% on just a humidifier. Humidifier is going to be the gold standard. I love Pebble Trays. Another one, we're going to get into building some for our grow space here. We're all excited about it, is building some DIY water fountains. For our grow cabinets, we actually use pet food, what is it called? Pet fountains, water fountains. Like if your cat wanted to have like a continuous fountain to drink from. We have a bunch of them, and we add a antibacterial, it's like a surfactant, basically like a soap for horticultural stuff. We add a little bit of that to the water to help prevent algae from growing. And by having that pet fountain in our enclosed space, that helps to boost humidity in a space where we don't have a humidifier. So I tend to do more of like, it's like a holistic, like we're going to do a lot of little things to not have to rely on the great big thing so much, or make the big thing like the humidifier have to work so much harder. You don't want to have like 4 humidifiers in one room. Maybe you have one where closest to the plants that need it, and then you have these other tricks dispersed throughout your space. Awesome. Let's see, I think that might be, I'm gonna see if there's anything else. Oh, I did have one other thing. Because I have found in doing these that some people, they're like, I want to do this. I don't really know what to expect. So I wanted to show you another plant that is super common. I bet all of us here have this. So there's one is, what does it look like when these ZZ plants or snake plant roots out? So this is a ZZ plant. And I was in like a Facebook group and someone was talking about like, cutting back her plants or something and pruning them. And ZZ plants aren't plants you generally want to prune, but something was happening, it was too big or part of it had died and she was trying to save parts of it. And so I was like, the tips look good, you could cut those and propagate those. And some people didn't realize that instead of just doing a division of the plant from the bulb, from the rhizome, that you could take a cutting and just stick that in water. For these ZZ plants are pretty succulent. They're waxy leaves. The bigger they are, the thicker the leaves get. They definitely like to dry out between watering. So when it comes to callousing these, I tend to err on what's in my hand. If it came from a bigger, more succulent branch, I might let it callus over for like, an hour or 2 hours. This was like a top cutting from almost new growth. It's very flexible still. The leaves are very papery thin. I think this literally, I snipped it and I stuck it in another little jar. And then this, if she will come out, woo, I don't know, guys. Oh, I really want to show you. This one's a cool one. Yes, just do it. So this was part of a snake plant. And you see how there's that J shape? I think we had some, and it happens, where they were growing out the drainage hole. So they were growing out of, they have a drain, oh yeah. It was growing like this out the side of a pot. And I was like, okay, that's ridiculous. That's too much. And it was like the whole stem is growing out of the pot. So I cut that off and I stuck that in water. And I probably could pot this like in a little 2 or 3 inch pot right now and get it going. But I might wait to get some more of the same species of leaves and then pot them together. And so snake plants are very tough, very resilient, and you can have even these little teeny cuttings. She wants to go back in. She does. Yay. Boom. That's that. And so I love the little jars for little cuttings because they can like sit on your windowsill. They sit on a ledge. They, again, you want to be mindful of what kind of plant it is. Can a Sansevieria grow in lower lighting? Yes. Will it thrive? No. No, it will not thrive. It wants light too. So that's why a windowsill is nice because it's going to get some kind of filtered light. If you have these on your desk, you want to make sure that you treat it like a plant. You can't just put it, it's not self-sustaining. It still needs light to grow. So even with these guys, we have a very sunny space. So our shelves are maybe like 20 feet from the window, but it's such a big open sunny loft. In my house, all of my shelves, like my plant shelves, are actually, they go right across my dining room windows. That's where I would put a plant like this. Okay. But you can take snips and that's it. That's how you do it. Does anyone have any additional questions for us?
I have a very specific question, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay, what are your thoughts on air layering a monstera with plastic wrap and like cocoa core, cocoa chip mix?
I love the cocoa core, cocoa chip. If you can, I would recommend mixing some kind, if you're up for sphagnum moss and you're okay with it, go ahead. I would mix it in there because that's going to help. Cocoa core is spongy, but it drains fast. It's less spongy, less absorbent than peat moss, right? So that's fine. The chips are not absorbent at all. I mean, they are, but they're not really there to help. They're there to help with drainage and airflow. So something like sphagnum moss mixed into that also is going to help to keep things humid and moist in the pot. One thing, how tall is the mother plant?
Right now, it's about 2 feet tall.
I have, and we have a few different versions of this on our Instagram because before we had a grow space, all of our projects, and that's the best way to describe them, all of our projects were happening in our shop. So you could come to our shop and be like, that's looking great. That's kind of weird. You know, you would see it in live action happening. And so something that I did, I think for a minute, I did, I would get, especially for like that size, I would got a trellis. This one is maybe 16 inches, but you would just get a trellis that works for the height of your plant. Go ahead and pot it in with the plant so that it's really in there and anchored. I did a version where I used sandwich bags and I put all of the moss and grow medium in the sandwich bags. And then I kind of like, it was almost like it was like a leech. It was kind of just like the opening of the sandwich bag was around that aerial root on the plant. And then to help support the bag and the weight of it, I used, I think just like, you know, gardening, like twine or wire and tied it to the trellis. That's what the trellis is there for, is to support the weight of that new little thing. When I got the bag, before I filled it, I cut holes in the bottom of the bag. The only thing I really didn't like with doing that method was I felt that here's the bag, everything towards the top, because I only had one way to water it. I had one like access point to water it. The water always went to that lowest point. So if the root really wanted to kind of grow up and around, it was going to have a longer journey to get down there. What I ended up switching to was taking net pots, like an orchid pot or even just a nursery pot, and I would wire it to my trellis and just treat it like a nursery pot. Just treat it like, okay, I'm going to coax those aerial roots in there and go ahead and put my growing medium in. And your medium sounds fine. I would just maybe increase, and the cocoa core is fine. It might be, depending on how dry the home is, that's when you want to increase how absorbent something like one of the ingredients is. So that could be fine. I just think the bag might be a good way to try something out and see how evenly is the water being distributed through the bag. I found by doing it this way, I was able to water the entire grow media, and then really make sure that those roots were dispersed and moving through. So when it came time for me to, like, even the big one, the air layering pot was, I think, a 10-inch pot. And it was so sad. It was like on a table with a stool, and the pot was on the stool. And like it was just like, it was like a little queen. She held presents in the store. And we were like, oh God, we have to cut this and take up so much space. But that's what worked. So by the time we cut it, even though we're cutting that main stem, the entire pot was a root ball. And I think that was the biggest difference I found between using a pot and a bag. That helps.
It does. Thank you so much for this and for everything tonight.
Oh, totally. It's a pleasure. Anyone else have any projects they're working on? I think, let's see. I think that was I want more kooky ones. I will show you this. I'll let you guys turn to pumpkins, because we kind of hit on it. This is a philodendron. I'm going to butcher this name. Campospartanum. This is the juvenile form. These turn into bigger ears and lobes as it gets bigger. This plant is a prolific grower. If you do like to do little plant purges and sell, here and there, this is a really good one to get because it makes a lot of plants. All of these brown hairy bits and these green bits, these are aerial roots. So what is neat is we talked about, put this guy here. When we talked about stretched pothos and only getting those nodes and trying to propagate just a stick and which way is up and that kind of thing. What's neat with a plant like this and what I'm doing with it is I want to make it grow as long, it's a vining plant. So I want to grow as long and dense as it can before I go to propagate it again. That it can kind of feel sad sometimes to like chop up a more mature plant to get more plants. You might be like, I kind of like my plant. I want to keep, I want to keep some of it and not have to always be chopped up into little bits. So what I'm doing is I'm really letting this one get established and mature. And that's when I'm like kind of just then gingerly pruning up, and it's like a foot. I really can cut about a foot off each time because it grows so prolifically. And because of the way it grows these aerial roots, philodendrons do wonderful in water propagation, but I actually just get these going right in a moss. Sometimes they'll call it like a moss soup. And it is where you have your moss potting media mix and you're growing multiple nodes in the same pot. So I might cut, I think I probably would even do single nodes of these because it's so rooted so well just in the air that I would do like 3 or 4 nodes, individual nodes, pot it in a pot this size. And then I put it in my greenhouse where it's high humidity. And then each one would root and grow out into a new plant. But this is what it looks like when it's kind of like all together before any of the cuts have taken place. So there's that. So let's see, does anyone have any other questions about potting mix, mixing your own stuff up? They're feeling brave and you're going to be like collecting some different perlites and sizes. You might notice that this is perlite, but these are huge pieces. And if you do like the idea of an aeroid mixed soil, this is perlite number 4. It's harder to find in our shop. We just started carrying some in our shop, but it's perlite number 4 is pretty much the standard industry name for it, but they are huge pieces. This is about 1 inch in width and very chunky. So this is kind of in the same family as using cocoa coir husks or large or like orchid bark, fir bark pieces. It's meant to help a plant drain quickly, but still it is porous and it will absorb some water. So it helps increase the humidity around the roots. But you can see it's a big difference than the perlite that usually comes in standard potting soil. So if you're feeling brave, you can start to like, what I think is the easiest way to start is go ahead and buy whatever you buy as your potting mix, but start to play with these other amendments and treat them like cooking ingredients. Treat them like if you're gonna like, you know, buy a boxed chicken stock, but you're like, but then I start adding stuff to it. And that's how I would treat these other amendments to kind of start to get more comfortable tinkering and making more specific grow medium for your plants. Because like this one is in an aeroid mix. So this is super airy. This plant likes to be a little more on the dry side. It's got charcoal, there's perlite, probably like the standard coarse perlite is numbers 2 and 3. And then these chunks, this is cocoa coir before it has been like shaved and ground down into this like a finer fiber. So this is the chunks of it. And so what's neat is if you go to water it, I always kind of think when they describe where these plants come from, and if ever you have to go for like walks or hikes and stuff, and you like collect rocks, and you're poking around under like a bed of leaves, and you kind of see how those leaves break down and what part is staying wet, and the chunkiness of it and what's growing there. That's how I kind of think about aeroid soil, is that in the wild, this plant would maybe get knocked off by an animal off of whatever ledge it was already on from the mother plant, like a branch, and no, but get knocked off. So what is it going to land in? It's not going to land in a perfect potting soil. It might be perfectly fine living a happy life in it, but it would probably land in something that looks a lot more chunky, that has more like maybe worm castings in it, it's a lot more organic materials. And so that's when it's fun to start to experiment with, does changing my grow medium affect the plant? And now I can see characteristics of the plant that I didn't notice before. Like I realized, wow, my philodendrons can really go for long stretches without being watered because they don't actually need it. And they're getting enough from this chunky mix. So yeah, you get out there and start, experimenting and try it out.
Well, on behalf of all of our participants tonight, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I know we're all excited to get out there and propagate some of our plants and experience and continue growing together. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. If you guys have any questions, you can message us at Plant Salon Chicago on Instagram. I'm the one who answers it. So you can totally send me photos of something and be like, what's it doing? Or look what she did. Isn't she so cute? So it's Plant Salon Chicago on Instagram. We're also on TikTok. And then you can check out the things we have at plantsalon.com.